Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on concept note writing. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Emma Day. I'm Executive Director of INHSU. For those of you who are perhaps less familiar with INHSU, we are the International Network on Health and Hepatitis and Substance Users. We are a global, not-for-profit, member-based organization dedicated to improving the health and well-being of people who use drugs. Each year, we host an annual conference which brings together researchers, healthcare providers, policymakers, and people with living and lived experience of drug use. This year's conference will take place in Cape Town in South Africa, 14th to the 17th of October, which we're very excited about. Early bird registration is now open. That closes on the 27th of July, and late breaker abstract submissions open on the 12th of May. So some dates for your diary. There's lots of ways to get involved with INHSU, not least becoming a member. This will give you access to discounted rates for the conference and lots of other benefits. Membership is free for people with lived experience of drug use or viral hepatitis or HIV, and students and postdocs within 3 years of finishing their PhD. I'd also recommend, if you do become a member, joining our early mid-career researcher special interest group. They're a fabulous group doing lots of great work, and they bring together academics from around the world to focus on topics that are important to emerging researchers. So definitely check them out. To give you a bit more background to this webinar, so this is part of a mini-series that we're putting on, kind of gearing up to a side event adjacent to the Cape Town conference. So that we're going to be delivering a research writing workshop on the 12th and the 14th of October next to the conference in Cape Town, with the aim of supporting participants to advance their research paper to the next stage. Those of you who have already submitted an expression of interest for the workshop will know this already, but just for anyone else, to be considered for participation in that research writing workshop, applicants must submit a concept note outlining their proposed research output. The concept note will be assessed on the following criteria: so background clarity, articulation of your aims and objectives, appropriateness of the study design methodology, and appropriateness of the proposed mock tables, figures, or qualitative research outline. Results outline. Some key dates and next steps relating to this research writing workshop. The concept note submission deadline is the 25th of April. Selected participants will then be paired with a mentor in early June. There will be a paper outline writing webinar, so the next one in this series, sometime in June, and then participants will work with their mentors to draft their paper outline. And then we'll be gearing up for the in-person research writing workshop, as I said, on the 12th and the 14th of October. If this is of interest to you and you have not already expressed an interest in the workshop, please do reach out to me. And just a note that participants must have submitted an abstract to the INHSU conference in order to join that workshop, but late breakers will be considered. So just something to have in mind. Positions at the workshop are very limited. It's only going to be open to 15 to 20 participants, but do reach out if you've got any questions, and if it's of interest, we'd love to support you to get them. So our webinar this evening or this morning, depending where you are, we've got some fantastic speakers who are going to be taking us through how to write a good concept note. So Professor Jason Grebley, who is President of INHSU and Head of the Hepatitis C and Drug Use Group at the Kirby Institute at UNSW in Sydney. Scientia Professor Carla Trelaw from the Centre of Social Research in Health and the Social Policy Research Centre at UNSW, and Dr. Andrew Scheiber, Technical Advisor at TB HIV Care and a researcher at the University of Pretoria, and also an INHSU board member. A few housekeeping notes before I hand over to Jason. So please keep your cameras off and your microphones muted just to minimize distractions. Use the text box for any questions. We'll have some Q&A after all the speakers have presented, but feel free to put your questions in there throughout. If you see a question in the chat box that you'd like answered, just give it a like or a thumbs up, and we'll try and prioritize those ones. If we don't get to your question, or you think of a question after the webinar, please just email us anytime, and we'll do our best to answer that. We'll also circulate a frequently asked questions document alongside the recording of the webinar. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll hand over to Jason. Thanks, Jason.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, and good afternoon, good morning, I guess, wherever you are. Yeah, thanks so much, Emma. I really appreciate it. As Emma mentioned, so I'm Jason Grebley. I'm a professor at the Kirby Institute at UNSW Sydney. And so we're gonna try and tackle a little bit about uh, concept notes for a paper. So here's what I'm gonna cover. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a perspective on sort of my journey, things that I perhaps had wished I'd done differently, and how I do things now, and might provide you guys with a bit of context about why we're talking about concept sheets. A little bit about why do we even write a concept sheet or an analysis plan, you could call it. Just some general guidance on writing concept sheets or analysis plans, and then key components of a successful concept sheet, and a little bit of common pitfalls to avoid. All right, so where did I begin? So I started off actually. I was doing my bachelor's degree, and there's a guy who's in my organic chemistry class, and he was working for a biotech company, and they were doing some stuff around HIV therapeutics, and I was like, oh, that sounds pretty interesting. So, anyways, I ended up getting a summer job in investor relations, working for this biotech company. And while I was there, I started to sort of get an interest for doing sort of HIV related stuff. And one of the um, sort of board members for that company was an academic at the University of British Columbia. So I actually had to I went back and did a bit more of an education so that I could do the prerequisites to get into a pharmacology degree. I actually had to do a year, sort of a tester year, to see if I could cut it in that area. So. But yeah, so I did a sort of master's and then I transitioned into a PhD and started doing work with people who use drugs in the inner city of Vancouver. Um, so yeah, that's a picture of UBC if you guys have never seen it in Vancouver. A beautiful campus. Vancouver's a great city. I must say that sort of I had a great supervisor, and provided me with lots of opportunities. But I must say that he was a really busy physician and didn't have a lot of protected academic time. So, I kind of sometimes felt a bit alone. I had another couple of students that I was able to draw on, but one of the things is so he was also very supportive of me attending conferences, and I also found lots of scholarship opportunities and stuff to get myself to conferences to present my research. But I started figuring that I would always get myself into the same problem. And I would go and I would sort of analyze my data, sort of April, May in the year. I'd then go submit an abstract for a conference. And in this case, at the time, it was sort of the American Study for the Associated Study of Liver Diseases, so AASLD. So then to go submit the abstract, get super excited, the abstract would be accepted. And then what I'd find myself doing is preparing the data for presentation again. I would then review my data with the supervisor, and he'd provide a bunch of great suggestions and ideas. But what it meant is I had to sort of go back and redo and present the analyses because I'd missed some bit and hadn't, thought of the sort of a key part of the study population or whatnot. So anyway, so I started to get a bit frustrated with that. So this is how I sort of do things now, and this is sort of all the students and postdocs in our program tend to sort of structure things. So yeah, it's a bit dreaded because it is a little bit of work, but I think it's really helpful, and what it does is it really provides you with a blueprint for each of the publications that you're going to be sort of working on. So it sort of, if you think about it, I'll go through each bit, but generally you have sort of a brief introduction, really clearly articulate your aims and hypotheses. Then what's really critical is just, so if this is going to be sort of an epidemiological paper, defining what your study population is going to be, This is really critical because if you get that wrong, then you have to go back and do all your analysis all over again. So yeah, it's just important to get this nailed down up front. Um, also, any proposed sort of methods or statistical analyses that you're going to do, and then any proposed tables and figures. So we'll run through this together. Um, the other thing is it does not need to be long. This really needs to be kind of a brief summary of what you're going to be doing. So it does not need to sort of exceed 2 to 3 pages, and that's not including sort of the tables and figures. Okay, so why have this? I think it really provides you with a clear guide to plan all your analyses that you're going to include. The other thing is it allows you and your senior author or collaborators to agree on what you're going to do before you actually start the analyses. And by doing that, it reduces a lot of replication work. If you nail all this stuff down and this sort of recipe for what you're going to do, it saves a lot of pain down the road. The other thing is that it allows an opportunity for your co-authors to provide some input. So early on, I think one of the problems with co-authorship is that um, contribution is relative to opportunity. So if you don't provide that, opportunity, then that makes it difficult for people. Um, all right. So, sorry. The other thing I wanted to sort of touch on is authorship. Because I've started to do this a little differently in more recent years. Um, Look, often what I'll do is list the first author, who's going to be the first author on the paper, and then list the senior author. So then it's really clear, and I'll explain the authorship positions, but at least then it's really clear who's doing the work, which is the first author, and then who's kind of supervising the research. Um, the one thing is I started to then now, because what happens is once you put this concept sheet out there and you set an authorship order, your co-authors and the other people you're working with kind of then expect that that's the place that they're going to be. But like you're just at the concept sheet stage. You haven't like done any analysis. People haven't had a chance to read the paper. So there isn't really that much opportunity to provide contribution at that stage. So what I then did is sort of move to, okay, well, I'll just list all the people who are contributing in alphabetical order. So it's pretty clear and then state that. The other thing is, though, is that you get a lot of people who don't actually contribute to the paper after the fact. So what I've actually moved now towards doing is actually not listing any authors on the concept sheet, maybe just the first and the senior, so it's really clear who's doing the work and then who's the one supervising. And then by listing none, people become the message becomes pretty clear that they're going to have to do some work to get onto that paper. So that's kind of, I guess, how I've transitioned things over time. But what it does is it does allow you to easily allocate the authorship order based on people's contributions rather than just being on a piece of paper. And how do you determine that? Well, really, there's guidelines. The International Committee for Journal Medical Editors um, sort of recommends that authorship be based on four criteria. So the first one is substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data. Yeah, so so substantial. So number one, I've gone through. Number two, drafting the work or revising it critically for important intellectual content and final approval of the version to be published, and also agreement to be accountable for the work. So it's not just like replying to an email that says, yeah, looks good, I'm happy with that. You know, you really have to be involved in those aspects of things in order to be a co-author. Okay, so this is just one paper. I just randomly took one of my old ones. What do we think about authorship order? And look, there's lots of it varies by field, but look, there's generally some sort of key things. The first one's really easy. The first author, that's the person who does all the work. Usually they're and so, the first author is the one who generally would do the analysis and write the paper and all that sort of stuff. Um, the last author, again, reasonably clear. It's the person who sort of supervises this particular analysis. So they're working very closely with the first author to sort of provide leadership and mentorship to get this work done. Um, Look, the second and third author, fourth author are sort of, other major contributors. Um, and so, but then again, after that, honestly, personally, I really don't care in terms of authorship order. Sometimes maybe you still maybe, because some people maybe do care and there is symbolism in there. So maybe you might try and delegate the rest of the order based on who contributed to various bits and pieces and sort of align it that way. The other thing I just wanted to sort of note is that it's becoming more acceptable to have what's called joint first author or joint senior author. And what that means is that when you would publish it, you might put a star in front of the first two people's names, and then you say contributed equally. Because it's really hard. All the, this in this day and age, we're collaborating with so many people, and we want to give recognition. And it may be that two people really contributed equally and should deserve the first authorship, or two people supervise the research. And maybe you have an epidemiologist and a health economist who were working really closely and provided equal mentorship and leadership. So I think you just know that it's becoming more acceptable and it does make things a little easier as well. Okay, introduction. I have a pretty formulaic. If you guys were here for the abstract writing workshop, I had a formula for that. We're going to run a paper writing workshop later this year. I've got a formula for that. And again, part of this is personal preference, but I think a lot of people would sort of agree with this sort of framework. And Carla, we're lucky to have Carla Trelaw that's going to present after me, and she's going to present sort of a social science or a qualitative research concept sheet, and to give you guys an idea of how that might differ, because it might differ a little bit by the field. But I think, look, the general concept is the same. So paragraph one, why is this topic important? I think by the end of that paragraph, you really just want to nail that. It doesn't need to be long, 3 or 4 sentences, but sort of why is this topic important? Introduce it. Is it, this is a big burden globally, but so for example, testing and treatment remain low. And then really highlight by the end of that first paragraph, the person should know what this topic is that you're going to be writing about. Paragraph two, um, look, you really touch on what is known about this topic. So, if there's a recent systematic review that's been done, or, so if your paper is going to be about how to scale up point of care testing for hepatitis C, then in that second paragraph, it should be, what's known about point of care testing for Hep C. What's known is it, what about a systematic review that's been done recently, or a couple of key studies that have been published? What do we know? Um, you want to kind of maybe touch on what are the limitations of the work to date, maybe. So, okay, this is what we know about point of care testing, but there aren't any studies that have looked at this, and this, or the limitations of the studies is that they've been single center, small sample sizes, blah blah blah. You're foreshadowing why your piece is going to add to the literature in this regard. So yeah, what are the gaps in the knowledge that this research will address? Paragraph three, and again, paragraph two could be actually two two paragraphs, but again, you're keeping it short. And I'll tell you something. Paragraph three is generally your aim, well, putting it in context, actually, sort of paragraph three is kind of like, the rationale for why you're doing this study. You might sort of end with that. But you have two options though for your concept sheet. This is my opinion. Either make it really concise. Don't spend a lot of time with the references. Just sort of get your three kind of pieces together, or write the introduction as if you're going to write the introduction for the paper. Now, I honestly, I generally go with number one nowadays. It kind of depends on how much your analysis you've done and how much like what the story is going to be. I'll talk about later in the sort of paper writing workshop that we're going to do later this year. The introduction is often the hardest part of the paper to write. So starting with that can sometimes be the most daunting, because you really got to sell the story. You got to convince the reader in a couple of paragraphs why they should read on. and why your work is important. So anyways, so I often just go with number one, concise intro, 3 or 4 sentences per paragraph, just to really clearly articulate so that your collaborators know why you're doing this and they can easily get the context. All right. Um, then you've got to write any aims and objectives. So it's really important to be concise. And these are the key things that you want to sort of describe in your aims. So what's your outcome? If there's any interventions that you're looking at, and then sort of what is the study population. So yeah, try to be concise, really important. You don't need like an 8 line objective. It needs to be to the point. So here's an example. Um, so this is one objective. So to evaluate, so the proportion of people who initiated treatment for hepatitis C infection within 12 weeks of point of care HCV testing among people who've injected drugs greater than daily in the previous month. So the outcome is the proportion of people who initiated treatment for hep C infection within 12 weeks. The intervention is point of care testing. And the study population is people who've injected drugs greater than daily in the previous month. So really clear. You've got your outcome, what the intervention was, and then what the study population was. And then your reader totally knows what you're talking about. Here's another example. It's not just outcome and intervention, but here's a very concise objective, right? To evaluate factors associated with initiation of treatment for hepatitis C infection. Super clear. You know what you're doing, and the reader should be able to pick that up. All right, methods. So follow whatever guidelines are appropriate for your study. There's lots of different guidelines, and just like for a paper, you can use a similar thing for the methods. I should note that the methods, you can do the same thing. You can either go you could go reasonably brief, or you can write them as if you're writing the methods for the papers. And to be honest, I am moving towards that with my students and postdocs, is to just write the methods as if you're going to write for a paper, because then you can just copy and paste it into the paper and then you're done. All right, what else about the methods? So again, if you're looking at an epidemiological study and if you follow maybe the strobe guidelines, it's really so that you might start with, what's the study design, what's the study setting, and what's the study population. And it's really important to clearly define that study population for all of your analyses. So, like, let's just say, I don't know, let's say you start doing an analysis and you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to do analysis in people with a history of injecting drug use. And then you realize, oh, shoot, no, 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 actually, I really wanted to restrict it to people who've injected in the last month because that's more relevant to my if you've done all these analysis in the population that had a history of injecting drug use and you decide to change it to the people who've injected in the last month, you have to go back and do all those analyses again, or figures and tables. And so, it's better to clearly define it. Look, it's made a little bit easier just for you guys. I remember when I was doing analyses in Excel. So it's a lot more work doing it in Excel if you're redoing everything where you're dropping filters down. And, that's what I did back a long time ago. Now I know how to use Stata and I can code, and people can use Stata or R or, whatever. But, it is a lot of work if you have to go back and redo the analyses. Describe the procedures for your study again, just like you would in the strobe guidelines. Clearly describe your endpoints and how you will define them. I think that's really important. So if your endpoint is going to be, sustained virologic response or cure of Hep C, you want to be able to define, well, what does that mean? So that's going to be, the fact it clearly define that means that it's going to be people who are hepatitis C negative at greater than or equal to 4 weeks following the completion of treatment. So just really clearly define what that endpoint is. Um, then you want to clearly describe any statistical analyses. So it's really important to define all the variables that you're going to include in your analysis, and also how are you going to categorize them. So if you're going to do unstable housing, be really clear. What were the survey questions that you had, and what categories are going to be considered unstable housing, and make sure that you then define how are you gonna, come up with the that variable of unstable housing. The other thing is that it's really important to develop up some mock tables and figures. It can be blank, or you can have dummy data in, but just put something in because it's really helpful to look at that. And then you can, like I said, consider writing your methods as if you would for a paper. Okay, so some common pitfalls to avoid. Look, don't have a really long background section. Keep it to 2 to 3 paragraphs. Again, this isn't for everybody in the world. This is for you, your supervisor, and your co-authors to sort of for you to be able to communicate to them in a couple of paragraphs why you're doing this study so that they can review the concept sheet with ease. Don't make your objectives or aims too long or overly verbose. Um, ensure that your endpoints are clearly defined, so that it's easy to be able to do your analyses. Another pitfall is that your variables are not clear or they're not well defined, or not all your key variables are included. The other thing you should be doing is looking, let's just say you have a survey, look through the survey. What are the things that you hypothesize are going to be, like, for example, associated with, whatever outcome that you want to look at. So just make sure that you include that. And again, if, make sure that your statistical analysis are well described. And if you're going to do sort of like a logistic regression model or some sort of model, just make sure that you define that in the concept sheet, how you're going to do that. One thing really critical, poor attention to detail, formatting, rounding of numbers. You have to have attention to detail because if your co-authors see that you're not, different font sizes, different font types, just really make sure everything's nice and tight and clean looking. All right. So look, I don't expect you to read this in detail, but there is sort of, thanks to Anna Conway, who sort of wrote this concept sheet some time ago, and this is actually linked to a paper that we published in IJDP, or Drug and Alcohol Dependence. Yeah, IJDP, I think. Um, but just to give you an example, so here's kind of why is this important. A couple of paragraphs about, and this is specifically about naloxone and non-fatal overdose. So why is non-fatal overdose is important. A little bit about naloxone access and take-home naloxone, and then a little bit about sort of what's known, and then a little bit here. So we talk a little bit about the cohort. So for example, Ethos Engage is a national cohort of people who inject drugs recruited from drug treatment clinics and needle and syringe programs. The Ethos Engage study provides an opportunity to better understand factors associated with overdose, naloxone uptake, and naloxone training to enhance the delivery of interventions to reduce drug-related harms among people who inject drugs. So again, you can go back and have a look at this in the recording, and the slides will be available, but this gives you an idea of one way you can structure your analysis plan. And Carla's going to go through a different one for social science paper. Aims. So this specific aim was to determine if polysubstance use is associated with recent non-fatal drug overdose, access to take-home naloxone, and receipt of naloxone training. So a very concise sort of aim written there. Study population and design. So, describing the study, where were the people recruited? What were the inclusion criteria? How did recruitment occur? And then of those participants, what were the procedures? In this instance, it gives a little bit of context around the study here in the second paragraph, just so that the authors have a bit of an idea, including a little bit of information about the sites. And then moving over to the right, you can see sort of these are the socio-demographic variables that we included. So again, really clearly defining those. And then a little bit more about how this data was coded. You can see there. Then, like I mentioned, really clearly defining opioid overdose and naloxone. So these outcomes. So how was this defined? And then a section on the statistical analysis. So, we describe the study population overall and into subgroups. And then we describe how we're going to create this, and then in terms of the regression models that we were going to do, and then any sort of sub-analyses or specific stratifications that we were going to, and then what software we used. So again, this just gives you an idea. Then actually in this instance, Anna had done some of the analyses, so she actually populated the concept sheet with some of the analysis. So again, really clearly outlining the different variables that you're including and the categories, and then having a nice clean tables with N and percents. Keep close attention to your decimals and stuff. If unless you've got like thousands or tens of thousands of people, sometimes people overuse decimal places. Like why go 21.5%? Unless you really have the precision, just round it up. It makes the readability so much easier. And you might not have the precision to be reporting something to 25.5% or something. So just say 26%. And then here's just another sort of couple examples of tables. This is looking at odds of opioid overdose and odds of receiving naloxone access or naloxone training. And then she had just highlighted some stuff, but and then just some other tables that we had put in, and then even some figures. And I think in this instance, she actually had put real data in, but if you don't have real data, just create fake data and just put a figure in so that your co-authors can see, or your supervisor can kind of see what you're kind of thinking. And then it gives you something that you can talk to your supervisor with and your other co-authors, and they can give some input on, whether they think that the data could be presented a different way. And then this was just some other supplementary table that we had put together, and then the references. So I will stop there, I think, because I'm going to hand over to Carla, who's going to talk a little bit about sort of language and some other components. But yeah, so we've got some time. We'll have tons of time for questions. So write down any questions you have or put them in the chat, and then we can address them later. And I will hand over to Carla. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jason, and hello, everybody. Lovely to see you on the call. So yes, a note on language. It's important, particularly when we're working in the space around people who use drugs, to think carefully about the words that we use, that we are creating knowledge as researchers with the words that we write on the page, not just reflecting what we hear other people say. So the words we use can be fundamental in shaping the realities and opportunities of people who use drugs and influencing health behaviours, health equity, and health outcomes. So using people first language, people who use drugs rather than drug users or injecting drug users, to use empowering and strengths-based language, avoiding jargon and slang, be specific and avoid generalizations, and using inclusive language. To be mindful of context and take care with language choice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about qualitative research, which is my expertise. And of course, most of the things that Jason has already said hold true. But when we're talking about a qualitative concept note, there are a few differences to bring out. So I've put up an example of a paper that I'm working on right now. And when we're looking for qualitative research, we're looking for theoretical concepts or frameworks that are going to structure the analysis and presentation of the data. So the topic, as you can see, is the proposed title, Stigma Reduction as Quality Healthcare, a qualitative study of existing structural level mechanisms useful for stronger action on stigma reduction in healthcare. So here is the introduction and rationale on the page for this concept sheet. So you can see that I'm pulling out issues highlighted in yellow there about organizational and structural levels of stigma. We want to think about already well-accepted processes to improve quality care and produce stigma reduction opportunities for strengthening quality of healthcare. Throughout the rest of the introduction, I've just bullet pointed what different paragraphs might be that talk about the costs of care, about stigmatized groups and quality care issues. I'm going to talk a bit about definitions of stigma, and getting down to the last question, the last paragraph of the introduction, to draw it all together and say, what's the question we're going to ask, and why are we active in this particular area? Now, there's no hard and fast rule. You might want to go further in the introduction to explain the framework that you're going to use to examine your data. But in this example, I've written it into the methods. So lots of things that Jason presented holds true. You need to very clearly define and explain the sample that you are working with, how you've recruited people, how you've collected data, how you've managed the data, and an ethics statement. But this component highlighted in yellow is absolutely crucial for a qualitative research project, is how are you incorporating your conceptual theoretical approach into your analysis. So we want to see here something that goes beyond, we're doing a thematic analysis of the barriers and enablers, for example. So in this example, I've bullet pointed it out that I'm going to take a pragmatic approach. I'm going to use the consolidated framework for implementation research. In particular, I'm going to use it the outer setting, and I've put in a table to show the definitions of the outer setting of this framework. I'm going to use some deductive analysis to think about how those structural mechanisms that I'm interested in align with the CIFA constructs. And I'm going to use some inductive work about how participants perceive the usefulness and applications of these mechanisms for stigma reduction interventions. So this needs to be in your full paper, a nice solid paragraph of your approach to analysis. In the concept note, you want your co-authors to be able to follow the logic of where you're going, the ideas that you want to explore, and how you're going to look for them in the data. So moving on to the results section, at the top of the results, you might describe the sample that you have looked at, and then have a number of paragraphs in your concept sheet that tell the story. So again, I've just highlighted in yellow how I'm connecting the framework, the consolidated framework for implementation research, and which components, policies and laws for the first example, and then some key quotes that I'm going to use to bring that framework to life. So there might be, little snippets of quotes about quality standards are the Bible, providing benchmarks of best practice, or they might be fuller quotes, like in the second component there, the CIFA construct of partners and connections. I have a fuller quote from participant 7 with a bit of attribution of where they're from. They're from a tertiary setting and in a management role. And then I have a fuller quote of a sentence or two that tries to explain what I'm trying to pull out of the analysis around this CIFA construct of partners and connections. And similar different types of things in the one underneath about local attitudes, and the one on the next column about performance measurement pressures, to think about how I can help my colleagues that are going to be authors on this paper understand the story I'm telling with this data. And I think I've got a final one of discussion. So again, you're just mapping out for your colleagues, your co-authors, how you're going to approach the discussion. So I've got a summary paragraph at the top of the things I think are going to come out, and then bullet pointed through the discussion section, the various ideas I'm going to pull out, some of the literature that I'm going to pull into my discussion, and then finally a conclusions paragraph that's going to wrap up the story. I might just answer one question there, if that's okay, from Charles in the chat. Charles has written it to me, but I think it's a good question to pose to everybody. Why do you choose a particular framework? Where do you get that framework from? Is it from a paper you've read recently? Or how have you come across the framework? Your expertise or a literature search? Where do you pick up these ideas that you're going to use to structure your analysis in a qualitative paper or in a quantitative paper? Really good question, because there are almost an infinite number of frameworks out there in the world to think about. In this case, we really wanted to literally understand implementation of this idea that we had. So implementation gave us the idea to think about, well, what are the frameworks out there for implementation? Again, there's a number. We thought about RE-AIM for a while, but we decided to settle on this one because it did give us access to the ideas of these macro structural level processes that we were interested in. So yes, it's a bit of all of that, Charles. What else have you seen in the literature? If, for example, you're reading some data and you go, wow, they're really talking about trust. Participants' trust in a health service or in a social service or in their peers, to go and then do some literature searching about what are some other papers on trust in your area, what kinds of frameworks have they used, what makes sense for the data you've got or the questions that you want to ask of it. So read around that conceptual area as well as the topic area, whether that be hepatitis C treatment or stigma, to think about the ways in which different ideas have come to life. So it's a bit of it can be a combined approach to identify the right kind of framework. Going and finding authors you like. What are they using? What's hot right now in your discipline? What do you want to contribute to some scholarship about? There's numerous ways to get into the question. And talking through your data via the use of a concept note is also useful, because you're trying out a framework to see if it fits. And then you can share this with your co-authors and go, okay, is this how you would see this idea being taken forward? Or do you have other lenses or frameworks that you think could work better here, or add additional things either in the analysis or in the interpretation and in the discussion section? I think I'm handing over to Andrew.
Great, thanks, Carter. So I just encourage people to put their questions in the chat. And I know as someone who is not as well published as everyone else, getting from your concept and your work into print material is a long journey, but I think having a concept note can be really useful, and it can also help you improve the time you spend with your supervisor, because often they're very busy people and it's in everyone's benefit. So any questions people might have, anything about the concept, the approach, yeah, or anything you would like to get more information on?
Well, people are thinking of their questions. And sorry, I know this is unfair of you guys, but because maybe you're doing other things, but can just by a show of, I don't know, you can use your like little React hand. How many people have actually done a concept sheet before? Got one. Anybody else? Just Faith. Charles. All right, so we've got a pretty new group.
Faith, you want to respond, please? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. On my side, I think the big issue was nailing down what the problem statement was, because I already knew, we already knew what we wanted to present, but just bringing it out was was a bit of an issue, like to my experience. And like also the just trying to like keep it there. There are places where I wanted to write longer, but I knew like it was supposed to be concise, and places where I wanted to write much less because at that point I didn't have enough to put in. So I think for me, that was kind of the experience I had.
That's great. Thanks, Faith.
I think that's a common experience. Also, what Jason and Carla gave examples of where you've done the analysis, but I think a concept note can also be useful when you've collected your data, you've cleaned your data, and you just want to maybe refine the aspect of your potential things you could analyze for a specific paper, and really having a clear description of your process for analysis, I think, is really powerful. And particularly if you're going to be engaging with people that will either support you, or maybe you're going to work with a statistician that might help with some of the quantitative work, or an experienced qualitative researcher that might help you or guide you to some frameworks. I think that's also another thing that Carla, mentioned reading, but I think speaking with your network and other people can also suggest really useful frameworks for areas of work of interest. And having table shells, at least in a quantitative perspective, can help you think really clearly about the kinds of variables and outcomes, and either the descriptive or the analytical statistical procedures you'll either do or ask someone to do. And when I engage with people, often they don't yet have that clear in their mind, and without that being really clear, you're not sure what data you're going to have to analyze for the later parts of the paper. I'm seeing someone has got a comment. Charles is just reflecting. Maybe I'll read it out. So it's Jason. I think it also matters how you write the concept sheet. Writing academically takes a certain skill that comes with practice. From a community perspective, the partnership with researchers, I cannot speak as to how important it is. Yeah, and I think that's what is important, is the concept note is intended to give you an opportunity to put through your ideas, and whoever you're working with, they can help you refine them or put them in a more academic perspective. Jason, do you want to comment on what?
Look, I think it's a really important point, Charles. And I think it's really important. So, here Carla and I are up here sitting, or I am sitting, talking about this. You guys, you've got to remember, what is it? You need 10,000 hours to be good at anything, maybe more. But we're speaking from the experience of over 300 papers. And then not to mention that. So we haven't written all of those, clearly PhD students and other collaborators, and we've collaborated, but we've read and provided comments on that many papers. And then, like Carla and I, we're also, co-editors in chief at the International Journal of Drug Policy. So not only have we written those, but then we read about 300 a year. So it's, again, I think it's just really important to put that in context to you guys, that this is not easy stuff. So if you feel like a struggle, that's because it is a struggle. It's really hard to get your ideas on paper. So, please, this is why we're running this kind of stuff, because this does take time, and it is a certain expertise, like you've said, Charles, and it's not easy, everyone. So if you struggle with it, don't feel bad. You're not alone, because it isn't easy. I don't know, Carla, if there's anything that you want to add to that, or if Andrew, you want to add anything.
It gets easier. I think that's also, Carla, what do you think? Yeah.
Yeah, practice, right? And experimentation a bit too, because the key for me is that you want to express what you're trying to say to your colleagues, and you want to express it in a way that invites them to get involved, to get excited, and to get involved about the work that you're doing. So laying it out clearly and doing that work to ensure that you can tell the story of your data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative or whatever it is, that you can tell a compelling story with your data and invite your colleagues in to make it even better.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to say, I agree completely, Carla. It's fascinating because I was in a meeting this morning where we were going through like a new paper idea or a new sort of thing. And you know, I think one thing that a lot of us suffer with, and it's even, at this stage of career, we still suffer with it, is going down a rabbit hole. And I think the nice thing with a concept sheet is that it allows you to be focused. What are you specifically looking at? What are you aiming to do? Because there's so many ideas. The list is endless. You can keep going and going and going and going until, because there'll always be new questions to answer. Each paper will just uncover more questions that you could potentially answer. So I think I forgot to put that in the presentation, but I think that's another thing that the concept sheet allows you to do. It allows you to stay focused so that you don't go off on too many tangents of like nice to have versus what's critical to the story. Like Carla said, what are the key bits that you need to make your convincing story without going on too many tangents? And we all do it. So it's not like if you find yourself going on a tangent, it's like, no, that's what we do every day, right? So just putting it on paper, though, allows you to try to focus as much as you can.
Yeah, and I just would like to add two things. So I see, I encourage people to read Charles's response in the chat. But one of the things that a concept paper does is that it allows for an iterative, collaborative process to developing a paper. And while Jason highlighted the role of the first and the last authors, often you may be part of a team and different people are bringing in different expertise into the paper process. And having the concept note quite well defined can help people add their input, but still keeping it within the initial defined scope. What we haven't spoken about.
Andrew, can I just say one thing to that? Because on to Charles's comment, and I've been fortunate to work with Charles. Him and I have been co-authors on several papers now. And I think what's been great is I think Charles and I have also learned how to work, community researcher together. And it's been even coming up with new ways of doing this, everyone. Like, Charles and I have sat on a Zoom call with like text in front of us, jointly writing words onto a piece of paper together. Charles, we did that, on the paper that we're currently working on together. And that was really valuable because I could hear, and Charles could then explain what he was thinking and why, and then we would just kind of jointly put the words down on paper together. So sometimes the sending around like this concept sheet by email to all these people is not the best mechanism to get input. So have a meeting, have your concept sheet with your collaborators and use that as the basis for the discussion, but then have that paper on Zoom or Teams or whatever, share your screen, and then go through it and discuss it rather than because some people don't respond well to having to like provide comments onto like a piece of paper that's sent via email. So anyways, and it doesn't matter if you're, I saw Tao's on the line as well. Tao and I have worked together. Tao's a clinician in just outside of Sydney, and where we've, had meetings with a bunch of clinicians. So it's not just, affected community. Clinicians are busy as well, and so instead of sending out some concept sheet or concept note to a bunch of clinicians who are also busy, sit down, schedule a call and get their input verbally and then integrate it into the concept sheet that way. I think we need to be a bit more creative about how we engage with people and integrate comments. Yeah. So sorry, Andrew.
I just think also part of the qualitative method is that discussion and consensus with co-authors. And Carla, I think like that, maybe you could comment of how the concept note could really be an integrated part of facilitating that discussion and contrasting among qualitative authors.
Yeah, definitely. And picking up Charles's comment about there's a range of expertise to bring in, including community perspective. So discussing your ideas, getting that feedback getting a really deep and nuanced understanding of your data and the lens that you're laying over the top of it, the framework that you're laying over the top of it, and what other bodies of literature or scholarship or expertise, including living and lived experience, that you can connect that data with. So sometimes, you know, it's not only about consensus, it's about bringing in new perspectives, new interpretations to stretch your work and make it very novel, so that you can sell it on to a journal to say, we've really got a very interesting take on our data, and that's why you should publish our work.
We haven't spoken about the role of AI in this component, and I know that there was a question flagged about that, but I don't know if we can perhaps give some guidance around, you know, the intellectual work of us as scientists or people or researchers versus the tools that AI can bring in the work that we do around efficiency, etc. So I don't know, Carla, if you'd like to give some of your reflections, and then also Jason, yours. And then if anyone else wants to have a follow-up question, please pose it.
Personally, I've not used any AI tools in my writing. Maybe I'm just old. I'm not even sure I'd know how to go and look for it to get it. I can see that it's a very useful tool for people who are writing in a second language in particular. For qualitative analysis, I don't think you should ever put qualitative data into a large language model. This is very sensitive personal data, and I wouldn't want that to become part of a language, a learning module for a AI, and it would be a key issue for our informed consent processes if participants did not know that their data would potentially be fed into large language models. The question from Lynn is about using AI to shorten the abstract. If you are publishing with some journals, there's a requirement to disclose whether you've used AI. So that would be part of the use of AI, to say, yes, you've used it for editing purposes. But Jason, maybe you've got a more nuanced reflection.
Look, I agree with you, Carla. Look, I think for the shortening of words, it's fine. Probably. I've never tried it before, but you know, you got to remember, I guess, everyone, that like garbage in is garbage out. So I think if you've got something good to work from, then I think it'll probably help to make it better. But the AI can't, or ChatGPT can't, probably can actually. I say this, I was gonna say it can't pull out the salient and important information. It definitely can. I've been just amazed and blown away by, some of what AI has managed to do. So I think it's untrue. Like, I just don't think we know enough about it. I'm not saying don't do it. Give it a go, but you better double, triple check that it hasn't screwed anything up and that everything is correct. I think for the language thing, it's probably fine, but I think you need to know how to present this information as well. But I've seen I've seen some fascinating stories accounted of people who've been using AIs for scientific discoveries where people have been working for like 5 years in a lab and then to find the certain discovery, and teams have thrown it into AI and have managed to do it in a week. It's just a remarkable, some of the stuff that I've seen come through. So anyways, I just think we need to be careful. I think Carla's point about putting data in is you need to be really careful about that. Remember that anything that you put through that becomes public domain. So you can't be putting confidential quotes from a qualitative study. These are people's words that are protected by consent and ethics and that sort of stuff. So you just got to be incredibly careful about that. same deal with data being thrown in. Again, people have consented to this not being shared with the entire world, that it's anonymized, de-identified, so all of those aspects. Sorry, I'm probably blowing on a bit, but I think it's, it's okay. But just be careful, I guess, and disclose it. Um, you know.
So I think AI is a tool, particularly for people who are kind of coming into this network, and it's around intentional use. I think people should be aware of those ethical concerns that have been raised. Also be aware that sometimes things that are drawn, if in your discussion, could be plagiarized. So be very aware of that whenever you're taking content that might be generated or produced by AI. Brooke in the chat is just highlighting that in terms of writing your abstract, there is some guidance. But I think prospectively, if you think you may be using AI in your methods, it should be part of your protocol. I think we highlighted that if it is going to be part of your consent or your methods, that it should be in your form consent form. And I just think as we're using these tools prospectively, that should be becoming part of our research methods. So we're aware how we will use AI or not. So I think it's just been really useful to keep thinking about that and to disclose when it is used. There is one question from Lynn about, perhaps you find another interesting item, but it's not in your initial objectives. Should it be included in the final paper? My perspective is, if it was part of, sometimes your paper is only a subcomponent of what your overall research objectives would be. So it may be appropriate to revise and integrate. It would depend, I think, on the scope of the paper. And yeah, perhaps Carla and Jason, you want to put your reflections on.
100% agree. I think it's totally fine to include stuff. The one thing you guys got to remember is that very rarely, maybe look, I guess a well-crafted concept sheet will provide a pretty good formula and a recipe for things, but things are going to change. It's just like if you're doing a PhD, what you submit to your PhD for admission is very rarely what your final PhD ends up being. So allow yourself to, you know, to go in different directions. I think it's okay. Just don't head down a rabbit hole and lose focus too much, I think, because you can then just be taken in a million different directions. I don't know, Carla, if you have any thoughts.
No, you've done that very nicely. Thank you.
The only thing that
Okay.
would differ, Andrew, just to say to people is that if you've got a clinical trial that you're running, that's the only situation where you need to be a touch careful. So if you've published a protocol and you've got a protocol for that trial, you will get in trouble with the reviewers for a journal if you're aiming for like really high tier journals. If you try to make modifications, particularly to your primary endpoint, that's pretty strict. So if you've done a trial, you've designed it, you've powered a study around that, if you make modifications to that, whether it's in, change of analysis of how you analyze that data, that needs to just be clearly stated in the manuscript that you diverted from the original protocol and that and again, your primary endpoint, it's kind of a bit of a no-no to change that. But if you're doing an epidemiological analysis of like a cohort or something and looking at just, an analysis, then it matters much less. But I just think just be aware that it does differ if you're doing a strict, like a randomized controlled trial and you've got a certain primary endpoint and you've pre-specified that's how you're going to do the analysis. Changing after the fact is kind of a bit of a no-no, but yeah, less of a problem for cohort studies or, yeah, observational.
Thank you for that clarification. Any other last questions or comments people might have? Great. So if not, I think I'm going to hand back to Emma. Do you have any closing thoughts or remarks? But thank you very much, everyone, for your participation, and we encourage you to please submit late breakers if you haven't. And we look forward to receiving concept notes for those people that want to be considered for the academic writing workshop. So if that's it, then thank you very much. And the presentation and the recording will be disseminated with everyone. Thanks very much, Carl and Jason, for your expertise, and Brooke and the team for the tech support. Have a good day. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.